Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this September 2nd edition. It's hard to believe that, let alone say it. It is the September 2nd edition, a Tuesday, of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I hope that everyone had a wonderful Labor Day weekend. One of those wonderful long weekends that we talk about where people cook out and enjoy family and those kinds of things. And I've talked to several people about their weekend, and all of them said, "Oh, it was really nice. You know, a lot of family interaction and that kind of." And that's really what it's about. So I hope everybody did have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. It is a pleasure to be back with you today, even though we have our abbreviated program on Tuesdays, because we do have another program on the Head On Radio Network that follows us at 3 o'clock. And then, of course, as we know, Bob Kincaid fires up from 6 to 9 each evening. So the Head On Radio Network is a great place to be for what I believe is the best in progressive talk radio and conversation. I don't like to say progressive talk radio. It's not talk radio. It's conversation. It's interaction. It's dialogue. It's learning. And I think that's what separates the Head On Radio Network from its competition. It is a pleasure to be with you. I want to thank you for being willing to give us a portion of this beautiful day. Here in the East, it's warm, and I guess we won't have that many more of these, but it sure is beautiful out, and it is beautiful here, and it is a pleasure to be with you. I've spent 2 or 3 hours this morning just kind of looking forward to the air, in large part because I miss it when we have a long break like we did over this past weekend. But even more than that, I continue to be excited by the material. I think that the deeper and the more we get into some of this material, the more excited I become about it. I hope that translates. I received a wonderful email from a listener this morning whose name is Jim, and he pointed out that he rarely has a chance to listen live because he works all day. He's a steel worker. And he listens to them on podcast. And he made the comment that he believes that that's true for a lot of listeners. And I thanked him for his email and told him that I appreciate that. I recognize that is indeed true. But from my perspective, I have to believe that there are live listeners out there. If I thought that I was just sitting here for an hour and a half or 2 hours and just recording a program, then it would be very difficult for me psychologically to get into the material, if that makes sense. I think that what level that might come through in these programs would be lost if I believed that there weren't some people out there listening. I made the comment to him that I have a relatively small history class that I'm teaching this semester. It just began last week. I only have 7 students, but from my perspective, it's enough. I mean, I prefer, 50, 75, or what you will, but 7 is fine because there are enough people in there to interact and to get excited about the material, and more important from my perspective, to get me excited about the material. Because I feel that this is very, very important as well as interesting stuff. And it's the passion with which I believe that I believe has to come across in the programs if anybody is going to listen, at least for the length of time that we're on. And that's why in a traditional call-in format where you receive one call followed by another call and there's always somebody else on the line, then basically you end up people listening end up hearing different voices and different points of view, etc. But to be able to sustain and to put up with the same voice for an hour and a half or 2 hours is very, very difficult. And so that's why I believe that there needs to be some passion and some excitement in the delivery and in the presentation. And part of that is tied to the belief that there are live people out there, that somebody at some moment is going to pick up a phone and call me and say, wait a minute, you know, and that's exciting conversation when that kind of thing happens. I invite you to be that person. We do have a phone number reserved exclusively for that purpose. Our number is excuse me, I've got the wrong number here. I think Bob Kincaid probably did a double take on that one. The number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. Under that, I had put down a cell phone number of a friend in Florida that I'm going to call later this evening. And I started to read you his phone number. I don't really think you want his number. You might. But again, the one that'll get you on the air here is 304-574-8178. If you'd like to email me directly, and that's what Jim did on his Labor Day, and I appreciate so much hearing from him. I came back into town after the long weekend this morning, and the first thing after I fired up the laptop, the first email I had was from Jim about the program, and I was so appreciative of the nice things that he said about the program, and the fact that you get an email which suggests, again, that there's somebody out there that's actually listening to what you're saying and hopefully getting something meaningful out of it. That's my passion. That's what keeps me doing this, and keeps me reading, and keeps me writing, and keeps me thinking. And so today, what I'd like to do on today's program is revisit an issue that we covered last week, which is the journal entry that James Madison made about the issue of adaptability in the Constitution, and his projections for population that we looked at last week. I spent quite a bit of time over the weekend thinking about that and recognizing that somehow this story, this information needs to get out. So what I thought I would do today is spend at least a portion of the program today, as much of it as the material warrants, to be very honest with you. I thought I would share with you some of the notes and some of the things that down. I'd review the content a little bit, review the theme a little bit, because I think that this may be some of the most significant programming that we've had here at the Virtual Center. I know I said that when we America book, which is Gary Wills's book, Federalist Papers, and we got into it somewhat, but then we get the Constitution on the Federalist Papers, etc. And we've been kind of over the last couple of weeks dealing with that. I have not forgotten the value of Gary Wills's book, Explaining America. I have it here. I have notes on it, and I think that the further we get into this, the more I begin to realize. I had wondered at the very beginning early last year, when we were just about to get the Virtual Center programming off the ground, whether in fact there was enough material to be on the air as many hours per week as I expected us to be on. And the more the more we do, the more I find that there's more information than we have time for. It's absolutely wonderful. I'm discovering things that in 50 years I really didn't know about, or if I read them years ago, I didn't really appreciate what I was reading. And I guess one could say that this is in part, at least, the result of experience, years of experience and years of teaching, and maturity, I guess. Of course, there's a fine line between heading up the mountain by gaining more maturity, and then coming down the other side when maturity becomes old age. and you hope that you postpone that as much as possible. The only difference is that the longer you retain the upside, the longer you are maturing and maturing, the higher the mountain gets. So consequently, when you do crest the top and start down the other side, if you're up high enough, you get down awful fast, and that's a little bit of what I'm worried about. But be that as may, it is a pleasure to be with you today here at the Virtual Center. Again, I do invite you to participate and offer your comments and your suggestions or observations on the talking about Madison. We'll be talking about the Constitution. We're going to be talking about the conflict between those who believe in the idea of a living Constitution and those who subscribe to the thinking, the school of thinking of Justice Scalia on originalism, the whole idea of constitutionality of legislation being benchmarked primarily against the thinking of the Founding Fathers at the time they wrote the Constitution. So we'll be into all of this. So if you have thoughts or ideas or considerations or things you would like to put out there for comment, by all means, we would love to hear from you. I apologize. I'm waving my arms around here and I hit my microphone, so that probably doesn't sound pretty good too good on your end. I apologize for that. As I mentioned, I wanted to return today to Madison's journal entry. It's in his papers, Volume 4 of the Madison Papers, Volume 4, pages 28 to 30, to be specific. It is an 1829 entry that James Madison made in which he is supporting and endorsing the inclination of most states during the period of the early 19th century to expand suffrage, to extend the vote, the right to vote, to more and more people, specifically to those people who are not property owners. Coming out of the colonial period and out of the American Revolution, every state established in its constitutions, once independence was declared in July of 1776, and Congress put out the word to the 13 colonies that they were now, as of the Declaration of Independence, they were now independent states, and as such, they should get about the business of drafting constitutions. And every state, in one fashion or the other, set about fashioning a constitution. And one of the similarities, one of the key ingredients that these constitutions contained was retention of the link between the right to vote and the requirement that one must own property to do so. A portion of a program months ago to the idea of the concept that it's very, very popular. You see it referred to all the time. It's called the staking system. That people who own something, people who have skin in the game, as it were, people who have something to lose if things don't go properly, are the only people with most thinking in early America was that there needed to be some property requirement associated with the right to vote. And of course, this is also tied up with the qualifications for office holding as well. That those who are going to see government, who are going to be making the law, need to be vested as well. And the assumption that most states operated on was that the more important the office, the more property the office holder must hold. The thinking is the more property you own, the more likely you are to be a thoughtful, insightful, well-educated, well-rounded, cosmopolitan, insightful person. Those are the kinds of people that needed to make the laws for a nation that increasingly believed that access to private property and the protection of that property was a key function of government. And of course, we've dealt with the debate as whether in fact it's principle, conservatives believe its principal obligation of government is to protect people's freedom to acquire property and protect people's property once it is acquired. So what you find is that most states established minimum property requirements for voting and increasingly escalated higher property qualifications for office holding depending on what the particular office was. In Maryland, which is the state that I know best because I wrote my dissertation on it as an example, and it's just an example, and it's been so many years now that I'm not even sure if I have the numbers correct, but this will give you an idea. This is the principle. As I recall, in Maryland, voters had to be able to demonstrate that they owned property valued at least 50 pounds, British pounds. Candidates for the House of Delegates, the lower house of the legislature, had to be able to demonstrate that they had property worth at least 100 pounds. Candidates for the state senate, the property qualification was 500 pounds. And a candidate for governor of the state of Maryland had to be able to demonstrate property ownership equal to 500 pounds. The principle is the issue. The numbers are not the critical thing here. The principle of escalation depending on the importance of the office is. Because what it tells us is the insight and the thinking of those who made and supported that law, that the establishment of these property qualifications. Obviously, the operative assumption here is that the more you own, the more qualified and capable you are of holding office. And the more important the office, the more property you probably should own. In other words, you want the top dogs, as it were. Those that Madison referred to in the letter that I talked about earlier in his entry of 1829. The large property owners of the country, Madison referred to as the real owners of the nation at that time. Those who owned most of the land, the property, at that time. We did, as we have talked about before, we were moving into the kind of economic development, the kind of economy where property increasingly began to include other things besides land. Stock, certificates or investments, public securities, what we call today savings bonds. Money that people loaned to government with the promise that it would carry interest. And increasingly, that kind of property is becoming more and more a consideration as we move into the 19th century and we're moving into a much more complex system of what we call capitalism, free enterprise capitalism. And once we get well into the 19th century, we're into the issue of manufacturing. And so consequently, capitalism itself begins to include industrialism, especially after the Civil War. Investment, stock, various kinds of financial paper, as it were, as well as landed property. And one of the most, and we talked about this before, but it seems to me we're right here. We ought to at least make reference to it. One of the most interesting issues to consider in reading about this transition, or the expansion, if you will, in the meaning of property, is the extent to which people at the time begin to make distinctions between landed property and what we would call securities. Charles Beard called it personalty. It's property other than land. It's property based on investments. And it can, again, it can be, it can be public securities. It can be various kinds of bonds. It can be, and that's what, of course, people have today. I mean, they own stock in corporations and various other things. So the point is that at the time that this transition is happening, there's quite a bit of literature which seeks to distinguish between landed property and so-called personalty, which is Charles Beard's term. The reason is because the nature of personalty, investments, is to spend. In other words, the whole idea of investment is to earn interest and grow your investment. So you're constantly buying and selling and reinvesting. Whereas when you get to landed property, you're talking about something quite different. Because coming out of Europe and coming out of colonial America, the idea is that one's landed property, one's landed estate, meant much more than merely what the land was worth in dollars. The landed estate was what made you who you are. It was the basis of your status in the community. It was the basis of your right to vote. It was the basis of your right to be a candidate for public office. It was the basis of your relative standing in the community as a person of reputation and a person of status. Consequently, nobody would talk about selling off the property, the landed estate. So one kind of property is the kind that's constantly being sold and reinvested, whereas landed property carries so many other social, political, and economic connotations that the idea of the landed, so-called landed aristocracy is to retain the property in its entirety. And the whole idea is that one kind of property is property you never part with. And of course, many states have adopted inheritance laws which mandate that the estate will go to the eldest son. And the purpose of those laws is to keep the estate whole as it's transitioned from one generation to the next generation. In other words, it is considered to be the worst thing you can do to the family's image, reputation, good name, and everything else, to break up the property and divide it among your kids. That would be suicide, because it would effectively eliminate the family's position and status for the next generation. So consequently, states required that property be handed down in toto from the eldest son, from one generation to the other. That was the way that the family position and family status was to be retained. That was that was a key consideration. And so it takes a while before this transition into industrialism and more financially focused capitalism begins to be accepted. That's why for a long time, socially, you had these two groups of aristocrats, the landed aristocracy and the industrial group. if you will, the investment group, at odds. We can see this all through early American history, the way that bankers and investors and insurance folks in the northern cities look with a jaundiced eye, as you were, at the landed aristocracy of the South, the planter aristocracy of the South, the slave owners, the masters of gangs of slaves. On the other hand, you find that the slave owners of the South tend to look down on the wealthiest of the merchant or the so-called middle class types, because it is believed that they don't have the character and the savoir-faire, as it were, to be considered aristocracy. So you have a very, very interesting social dynamic here. But the point of the issue is that the thinking was that the more property you controlled, the more intelligent, insightful, educated, and more capable you were to serve in these higher offices. And I think that is the key consideration. That, it seems to me, is the issue that we must deal with. The problem comes, and this is kind of the lead into. We'll pause for a couple of minutes and take a very short break at the top of the hour. But this is really the lead into the Madison, to the Madison paper that is the focus of today's program. Because the implication of all of this is that if you don't own property, you don't possess status. You don't exist. You are invisible. Think of the literature. Think of the music that speaks to the idea that people need to feel that they belong, that they matter. And in a society which puts a premium on property as the determining factor as to how much you matter, then that doesn't say a whole lot for those without property. The implication is they don't matter much. And if you read John Locke about the state of nature, you begin to get the idea in Locke that when Locke talks about life, liberty, and property, he really reduces all three of them down to the issue of property, because liberty becomes the right to pursue and have property protected. Life is looked upon as one's property from God. So in a sense, property is the key. And Locke makes the point that the only liberty that non-property owners have a right to is the liberty to become a property owner, is the freedom to invest your labor in a piece of property and make it your own. That's what life is about. That's what one's status and position in society is about. And until you do that, you don't have any status. You don't have any meaningful role in society from the perspective of the community at large. The danger is when society develops to the point that you have more and more people with no property and fewer people with most of the property. When you get a huge gap, inequality, between the few who control most of it and the many who are left to divide up the crumbs, so to speak. And Madison's issue here, how do you maintain and preserve the stability and the security of society when the very thing, property, that makes one important in the society is not available, that they don't have it? When you get large numbers of people without property, then there's no visible stake. They become desperate. They become risk takers because they have nothing to lose. And when proportionally too many of those exist in a society, Madison believes, as Jefferson believes with him, that you have the ingredients of social discord and revolution. So Madison's concern is, as we are faced with the kind of population growth and the emergence of larger and larger cities, where more and more people live off the agricultural production of a declining number of farmers, how big must the population become before the situation becomes so dangerous that a change in the political structure is called for? That's the context. That's the background of Madison's challenge. When we come back, after a short break, we will look at the way Madison deals with that challenge. I think it is one of the most important issues and pieces of literature that exists in the 18th century. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. We were talking about the music, and you sent me the word Mozart. And all I can say is, oh, he'll be making, people will remember him. Anyway, beautiful, beautiful piece of music. Thank you, Bob. This is the Virtual Center. We are into our second hour today. It is 6 minutes after the hour of 2 in the East on this second day of September, the day after Labor Day, 2014. It is a pleasure to have you with us. We are into the thinking of James Madison. Specifically, we are into Madison's view for building community. That is one of the, I think, one of the major messages that Madison gives us, is how government must successfully create community when the ingredients that traditionally produce it are not there. We'll be developing that theme this hour. I invite you to participate in the program by sharing your thoughts and your ideas on this subject with us. The phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. And before we go any further in this hour, let me make an announcement that we will not be doing a live program tomorrow, Wednesday, September 3rd. We will not have we do not have our producer, Mr. Kincaid, is not going to be available for tomorrow's program, and so therefore we will undoubtedly, play a former program, but there'll be no opportunity to call in as there is on the live programs. So again, if I neglect to mention it before we go off the air today, please understand that there will be no program tomorrow, Wednesday. So the next time that we get together will be next Monday afternoon, which will be September 8th. And we'll be there. We'll have our regular 2-hour get-together on Monday, the first day of next week. I mentioned at the outset of today's program an hour ago, and if you were with us then, I want to thank you for staying with us. If you weren't with us, then let me just repeat that we addressed this particular entry of James Madison. I did some checking. I had it in my mind that Madison died when he was 85 years old. He died in 1836. And I had it in my mind that he was 85 years old when he died. And so this weekend I checked to make sure that I was correct. And I was. Madison did pass in 1836 at the age of 85, which means that when he wrote this particular piece, he was 79 years old. It was 6 years before he died, 1829. Well, 7 years actually, 1829. So he was 78 years old. He was in his 79th year. And this weekend, I took the liberty of summarizing Madison's article. We looked at it. We basically read it last week, section by section, so that we all were together on what it means. And I thought that the way to approach this subject today would be to summarize Madison's essay. For those that perhaps weren't with us before and aren't familiar with it as yet, as well as those who were and would appreciate the summary. Let me kind of give you a plan, a strategy that I have for this hour. I mentioned that I was teaching a class, a history class with 7 students in it. And at the very beginning of the semester, we've only been into it 1 week. One of the things that I've been trying to do with my class is to make them aware of the difference between summary of content and interpretation of content. In other words, thinking analytically. Some people believe that summary is analysis. It is not. And so one of the things that I thought about this weekend that might be a good exercise for me and for us here at the Virtual Center is to take Madison's piece and do both. Summarize it and then draw conclusions or do an analysis of its importance. And what we will see is just summarizing the content is not enough. What analysis requires is a thesis, a topic sentence or a topic paragraph, an interpretation for which one can argue, drawing the support, the proof, the evidence from the document itself. So that's really what I would like to do here in our hour. So what we have going on here are two things simultaneously. We have a little bit of demonstration of the difference between summary and analysis. And on the other hand, we have a revisit with some unbelievably important content. So with that, let me begin by looking at Madison's argument. As I mentioned last hour, Madison's goal or purpose here is to extend or support the extension of the vote, the expansion of the suffrage to those who didn't formally have it, namely housekeepers and heads of families, whether in fact they owned property or not. State after state, and of course Madison is in Virginia. Virginia is liberalizing its laws on suffrage during this period and basically enacts legislation along with many other states to extend the vote to housekeepers and heads of families. And Madison's whole reason for putting this paper together is to support that expansion of suffrage. And so with that, here's a summary of Madison's case. Madison writes, and I'm not reading, this is not literal, I'm not quoting here. These are my comments, but hopefully I tried to stick very, very close to the content. Madison said, if we're trying to adapt the Constitution to the nation as currently constituted, which is mostly farmers, predominantly yeoman farmers, we could extend the suffrage as far as we wanted to without changing anything, without really materially changing anything. Government would not change, the laws would not change, because the vast majority of Americans who own property can vote. And as long as that remained the same, we could extend the suffrage as much as we wanted. However, Madison's point is that's not what is happening. In order to prepare our government, Madison says, for a long future, we've got to consider seriously the kinds of changes that are underway in society. The demographics of our society are changing, and they are changing rapidly. And what we are beginning to see, Madison says, is that the number of yeoman farmers is declining. And the number of non-farming, non-rural residents, primarily living in our cities, is increasing. So what we have demographically is a major transition going on in our society. The percentage of property owners is declining, and the percentage of those who don't own property is increasing. And the fact of the matter is, our Constitution has to change in order to address that. If we don't, we will be doomed. The Republic will be doomed. And last week, we looked at quotes from Benjamin Franklin, from Gouverneur Morris, from Hugh Williamson, from John Adams, all of them, from Alexander Hamilton, all of them predicting that at some point in time, that transition, that change in society would eventually require that we had to become a monarchy. We were going to have to do something to strengthen government. Republicanism, as we know it, couldn't continue to work with the increasing proportion of non-property owning people, people without a stake, without a vested interest. Property makes people conservative. Property makes people low risk takers. And so therefore, the security and the stability of government is directly related to the extent to which those with a vested interest in society, in government, control it. And if we continue to restrict control, power, to those with property, we're digging ourselves into trouble, because the number of property owners is declining and the number of those in the country without property is increasing at an incredibly rapid rate. Madison says, so long as we remain able, so long as we remain a society, even with people who don't farm, by making improvements at agriculture and other labor-saving arts, Madison calls them labor-saving arts, we will be able to increase our agricultural production enough that we'll be able to support a larger and larger population of people who don't farm. In other words, those who live in our cities will be living on food grown on our farms. And as long as we can continue to improve agriculture enough to improve the output, the amount of food that we produce, we'll be okay. But Madison said the nature of our society, he calls it the law of nature. Competition is reducing larger and larger numbers of our people to become wage earners who are making barely subsistence wages. By definition, a competitive society is separating citizens into the few who become successful versus the many who don't, who become less than successful. So not only are we witnessing an expansion of population of non-farmers, we're also experiencing an incredible increase in the number of people who, even though they work, are barely making enough to sustain themselves. Madison says that the proportion of people without property, or even the hope of ever acquiring property, cannot long be expected to support the right of the people with property to have power over them. In other words, the people with property make the rules. as we continue to have a larger and larger proportion of our population without property or with very little property, and increasingly with little hope of ever acquiring property, excuse me, then Madison's position is, how long can we expect them to accept the right of the property owners to continue to make the laws that govern them? Eventually, we're going to have a reaction. Consequently, Madison asks this question, and this is a quote: what is to be done with this unfavored class of the community? And then he basically lays out the options. And he says, if we know for sure that we can't afford to grant the same power to those without property as to those with it, then likewise we also know that we can't rest the future of Republican government on numbers of people that are becoming so large and overwhelming that at some point in time they are bound to turn on the people with property. History tells us that societies, especially republics, where the gap between those with property and those without it becomes too wide and too large, those countries, those societies face problems. And the result is the only way to control that becomes some sort of military power. Consequently, what we are facing down the road, unless we make some changes, Madison said, is some sort of military dictatorship in this country which threatens everybody's freedom. Consequently, Madison says the following, and this is a direct quote from his paper: this view of the subject makes it proper to embrace in the partnership of power every description of citizens having a sufficient stake in the public order and the stable administration of the laws, and particularly the housekeepers and heads of families, most of whom, having given hostages to fortune, will have given them to their country also. That sentence is critical to Madison's case. This situation, Madison is saying, makes it absolutely essential that we find a way to bring into what he calls the partnership of power all of those who have a vested interest, a stake in good government, and a stake in public order. That not only means property owners, it also means housekeepers and heads of families. These people, although they don't own property or a large amount of property, they have already bought in to the American dream. They have already bought into the idea that if you work hard and you plug along and you keep your nose clean and all the rest of it, you too might be able to make it big in this country. This is the first nation in the history of the world where real social opportunity exists for people. The ability to climb up the ladder in this society is greater than in any other society on the face of the earth. They've already bought into this. Therefore, why not include them into the group of those who make the laws? Why not give them a vested interest, namely the vote? They're much more likely to support and abide by laws that they feel that they had a part in, if not the majority part, in making. And in a republic which involves the election of representatives, if we allow people other than property owners the right to vote for elected representatives, we are in effect giving them an interest, a stake in society, which is as important to the stability of society, almost as important, as property itself. Then Madison goes on with this, and this is a quote, "This portion of the community, the householders and heads of families, this portion of the community, added to those, although not possessed of a share of the soil, are deeply interested in other species of property, in other words, investors, financial interests, Wall Street, bankers, insurance, industrialists, etc. People who are involved in property other than land, and adding both of these to the landowners, to the territorial proprietors, who in a certain sense, he says, may be regarded as the owners of the country itself. Add all of these together, Madison says, you form the safest basis of free government. These are the people who have a vested interest in good government, in law and order, in not making waves, in not, not disrupting anything in any way, because they believe that only in a stable society can they work hard and possibly move up and benefit from the opportunities available in this country. This is the point at which Madison makes his prediction about population. And he predicts that by 1929, 100 years from the time he's writing this, America's population will have reached 192 million. And he said, all we need to do is look around at other societies who have seen population grow like this. And specifically, he looks at Great Britain and he looks at Ireland as examples of places where population grows so rapidly that we are left with the conclusion that as we improve our ability to produce food and support a larger and larger population, we are in effect encouraging that larger and larger population. This is the position, if you recall, that Malthus made with his idea, the iron law of oligarchy. No, that's not the right term. I'm sorry. I'm having a senior moment here. But Malthus' argument was the idea that scientific advancements in agriculture, which make it possible to produce more food, make it possible to support more people who aren't producing their own food. And so consequently, population will outstrip the ability of the farmers to feed them at some point in time. And if Malthus, spelled M-A-L-T-H-U-S, if Malthus is not the source that you recall, then I point you to an essay written by the humorist Jonathan Swift entitled The Modest Proposal, A Modest Proposal. Swift is addressing the population explosion in Ireland. And in his modest proposal, he talks about the idea of dealing with population explosion by allowing the wealthy to eat the poor. In other words, the growth of population itself can become the food source for the people in society who matters. Now, this is obviously absurd. It's obviously tongue-in-cheek. But it's a classic by Jonathan Swift. Because what he's basically doing is pointing out the absurdity of statistics without emotion or without sensitivity or without feeling. So obviously his point is that human beings would never consider this But if we continue to go in the direction where logic is driving us, reason alone is driving us, this is the point at which we're liable to come. Consequently, Madison's proposal continues. Having laid out this scenario with what kinds of changes are necessary in society in order to deal with this reality. And Madison speaks to what he calls Republican laws of descent and distribution. Descent, I'm not talking dissent, D-I-S-S-E-N-T. I'm talking descent, D-E-S-C-E-N-T. Inheritance. The laws which govern the inheritance by one generation of what the previous generation had. And what Madison is proposing is that Republican laws of inheritance or descent and distribution of wealth and services and distribution are inclined, will, he says, affect the equalization of property of citizens somewhat. In other words, by passing laws which give government the authority to use tax revenue, for example, to take care of those who are unable to take care of themselves, this will relieve the problem somewhat. But Madison said we can't know how much exactly. But one thing it'll do, one thing we can do through our laws, Madison is saying, is we can change the way money is invested and distributed. No longer can society continue to produce luxury goods that only a few people can purchase. Instead of that, because we have so many that need jobs, we've got to begin to produce things that the vast majority of citizens are able to buy. We have to be able to create our own market. No longer can we continue to find employment for the population of people that need it, as long as most of our productive efforts are spent producing luxury goods for the wealthy. You can only make and sell so many yachts, for example. So consequently, the whole nature of the economy itself begins to change in the face of this situation. One result of these Republican laws of descent and distribution, Madison says, is that there'll be less money going into luxury goods, costly and ornamental articles consumed only by the wealthy, and instead there'll be an expansion of jobs to produce cheaper products that most of your citizens have some hope of being able to purchase. Another outcome of these so-called Republican laws, Madison said, is that the very wealthy must become laborers and cease to be just idlers. No longer can we afford the society where a certain class of people doesn't work and believes that work is beneath them. What we've got to do is become a nation of workers, not idlers. The idea here, of course, is that we've got to change. We've got to get away from the idea that those with wealth are flaunting it over those without it. You can't expect a society where population is growing exponentially, very, very rapidly, comprised of people who are working for, in many cases, subsistence wages, and constantly be throwing your wealth and the fact that you don't work in their face, because eventually they'll rebel. Consequently, you've got to change the whole makeup of society. Consequently, we will have more jobs, producing fewer luxuries for the wealthy, and workers themselves will become consumers of luxuries. And then, perhaps the most poignant sentence in Madison's whole paper is the following: to the effect that these changes, intellectual, moral, and social, the institutions and laws of the country must be adapted, and it will require for the task all the wisdom of the wisest patriots. We are going to have to have wise, committed leaders who are able to see what we are facing and are able to make the kinds of political and legislative changes necessary to address these. If we don't, then the predictions of military dictatorship or a monarchy or chaos will be the result. This paper seems to me to be one of the most substantive, meaningful pieces of history I've ever laid my hands on. The fact that it is written by James Madison, the father of the Constitution, himself, makes it even more so. Madison said there's no way to know for sure what we're absolutely going to be facing in a century or little century or more. But you can look at Great Britain, France, or Ireland, and you can begin to recognize that if the present Constitution, and he's talking from Virginia, the present Constitution of Virginia, he said, with all of its flaws, has lasted for half a century, it's not unreasonable to hope that we can amend our Constitution so that it'll last at least more than a century. That's the summary of Madison's paper. What are the conclusions? What is the essence or the substance or the significance of this paper? I would argue one of them is adaptation. Madison is talking about a system of government that must continually remain flexible and be able to change in order to meet rapidly changing conditions, whether they be economic conditions, whether they be demographic conditions, whether they be environmental conditions, or whatever. If we are going to preserve the nation, if we are going to continue to keep the public interest in focus as our primary responsibility, we have got to maintain a government that is willing to adapt in order to meet changing circumstances. And what he says in the almost the end of the document is that in order to pull this off, we are going to need the wisdom of the wisest patriots. Let me suggest to you that by wisest patriots, he does not mean advocates of original intent. He does not mean supporters of a second constitutional convention who want to dismantle and demean the federal government's ability to promote the public interest by returning power to the states which they control. In other words, returning our government to the 18th century prior to the Constitution. Those are not the wisest patriots that will manage us through the dangers of turmoil and revolution. Those are the kinds of patriots who guarantee that we will be facing a revolution in this country. What we are talking about, then, is that the founder of the Constitution, the author of the Constitution, the drafter of the Virginia Plan, which is the basic structure of the Constitution of the United States, believes and makes the case here for a living Constitution, not a static one, not a dead one, not an inflexible one, but a living document. What Madison is effectively saying here is that the very famous necessary and proper clause in Article 10, in Section 1, Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, is not the exception to the Constitution, it is the rule of the Constitution. Rather than single out the right of Congress to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out its delegated powers, which has caused such consternation, rather than focus on the ability of the federal government, Congress, to regulate interstate commerce, and focus on the extent to which the meaning of commerce has been expanded over the years in such a way that the federal government has become regulator and manager of a lot of things other than trade. Rather than starving the beast, rather than balancing its budget, rather than minimizing its ability to take care of the nation at large, to promote the public interest, to preserve the strength, stability, and security of community, those are your wisest patriots. I would suggest to you that if you think back, the paper that seems to be most in tune with what Madison is saying here is the very famous document written in 1910 by Theodore Roosevelt on progressivism, on the need for progressive reform in order to make sure that government has the opportunity and the ability to manage, contain, and control greed in this country. We must control the self-interest of the few in order to preserve opportunities and freedom for the many. And Madison is saying in order to do that, we need a government that is constantly changing. That's why we need a vigilant, intelligent, insightful, progressive Supreme Court that interprets the Constitution of the United States. I sat down, as I mentioned, this weekend and tried to put down in much more of an argumentative way in the context of an article on this particular document. What would I say and how would I say it? Let me share with you some of the things that I've said. My first line would be, Antonin Scalia, you are wrong, and now we can prove it. You took up the torch of original intent, carried for so long by the late Robert Bork, and you have been able to use your seat on the Supreme Court of the United States as a kind of bully pulpit to do just that, bully your living Constitution opponents into silence, if not quite total submission. What's been missing for them, what your opponents have been missing, is proof, hard evidence, the kind of juridical smoking gun that would become history's version of DNA, the kind of evidence that you never really felt you even needed, but evidence that you always demanded to see from those who disagreed with you. What your adversaries have hoped for, so far in vain, is commentary from the founders themselves that would enlighten us, once and for all, on the flexibility and the systemic adaptability that they built into the Constitution of the United States in order to keep it relevant. Documentation to prove that necessary and proper is the rule, not the exception, in our Constitution. Finally, the founders have spoken. Better yet, finally, we have listened. And from no less a credible spokesman than the Constitution's designer, James Madison. In 1829, in his 79th year, Madison made his case for the living Constitution when he endorsed new state laws to extend the suffrage to householders and heads of families. His message is as follows, and this is my effort to synthesize Madison's paper in 2 or 3 bullet points. This is his case, or his message. Population growth beyond the ability of agriculture to support it promises to place the nation in a very tenuous situation within a century, parentheses, estimated at 192 million by the 1930s. Second, competition for employment in a non-agrarian world promises wages which afford those earning them only the bare necessities of life, and a large portion without property or the hope of ever acquiring it, conditions which make them totally unsympathetic to the rights of those whose wealth translates into power over them. Third, this creates a numerical and physical force excluded from Republican government and liable to be turned against it, which in turn would lead to a standing military force in America that ultimately will threaten everybody's liberty. Madison echoes here the dire predictions voiced at the Constitutional Convention by colleagues Hamilton, Hugh Williamson, Gouverneur Morris, Benjamin Franklin, that the republic which Franklin famously reported as being extremely tenuous. Remember Franklin's very famous statement when he left the convention hall and was asked what they did, what we have, and his response was, a republic if you can keep it. All of these, including Franklin, believed that the republic would be short-lived, eventually to be replaced by a monarch or something much worse. Madison is forced to address the challenge to social order that he has predicted. What's to be done with this unfavorable class of the community, he asks. Since we can't give them an equal share of political power, and it would be unwise to rely on the preservation of Republican government on a group of citizens so large, so potentially powerful, yet so totally disconnected and politically excluded from the mainstream of society, what seems to be left for us to do, Madison says. His answer, and I've quoted Madison, to embrace in the partnership of power every description of citizens having sufficient stake in the public order and the stable administration of the laws, particularly the housekeepers and heads of families, most of whom, having given hostages to fortune, will have given them to their country also. Clearly, Madison envisions expanding the suffrage as a way to offset the lack of a physical stake in society, property, with a psychological one, the right to vote. He seems confident that the same faith in material opportunity that has kept housekeepers and heads of families plugging along for so long will transfer to a government that they believe that they now control. Already, Madison has given us lessons on the following, and this is where I think the conclusion is. These are the things that Madison has said to us in this paper. First, the importance of community to political and social stability. You can only maintain social order short of military dictatorship so long as you preserve community and you make the changes necessary to preserve it. And what that means is you can't afford to exclude people from community. You have got to find ways to include people into community. Second, the threat to community posed by exclusion, whether it's real or whether it's imagined, If people don't believe they matter, they don't. And if they don't believe they matter, they become potentially revolutionaries. They break the laws until they finally are able to unite with enough people to try to overthrow them. Intelligent government, shrewd legislation demands a community which always remains flexible enough to include everybody in it. Third, workable strategies for promoting inclusion for a strong community. Community must find ways to change in such a way that people who feel excluded are included. Clearly, in this document, Madison believes that the right to vote is such a strategy. And fourth, and this is so telling in our world today, the threat to order posed by a growing and too visible inequality in income and wealth. Madison's principal message, however, despite these four things that Madison tells us, his principal message, I believe, is that governments must remain adaptable, vigilant in their anticipation of change and their willingness to make the necessary political accommodations to address those changes. In language very synonymous to the warning that Andrew Carnegie would give to the wealthy more than a half-century later in his Gospel of Wealth, Madison defended Republican laws of descent and distribution as ways to equalize the property of citizens and reduce available surpluses in society to a bare minimum. You've got to keep the visible difference between the wealthy and the not wealthy as limited as possible. Madison, the paper goes on, that would channel capital into enterprises that create jobs and shift production into necessities that more people can afford, as opposed to the costly and ornamental articles consumed by the wealthy alone, who must cease to be idlers and must become laborers. Clearly, Madison is anticipating a society willing to adjust to rapidly changing, potentially explosive conditions. This is hardly the formula for measuring the legality of every proposed change against 18th century benchmarks employed by the founders. In his most poignant plea for administrative flexibility, Madison closes with an appeal to patriotism much more in tune with progressive than intransigent thinking, to the effect that these changes, intellectual, moral, and social, the institutions and laws of the country must be adapted, and it will require for the task all the wisdom of the wisest patriots. Madison closes with a prediction that in a century or slightly more, America will be as crowded proportionally as Great Britain and France. He surmises that if the present Constitution, with all its flaws, has lasted more than a half-century, it's not unreasonable to hope that an amended one can last more than a century. Clearly, Madison's idea of the wisdom of the wisest patriots is not to be found in those who would dismantle government, those who would look to a second constitutional convention to restore the Articles of Confederation to this nation, to those who would starve the beast by trying to balance budgets, or any other of the remedies associated with Tea Party reform in 21st century America. I guess what I'm saying, we have about 3 or 4 minutes left in our program. I guess what I believe makes this issue so important, which makes today's program so important, is that finally we have a response to those like Antonin Scalia who have been jamming originalism at us for so long. and saying basically, if the founders who drafted the Constitution didn't mean what this law says, then it's not constitutional. The idea of originalism is to suppress change, not welcome it. Madison's prediction is that in the unalterable face of proportionally expanding population, a constitution that cannot adapt is a constitution destined to die. Logically, realistically, most of us have known that. But we haven't been able to point to anybody who matters who says that. We've gone to Supreme Court justices. We've looked at John Marshall's decisions. We find that when they are interpreting particular clauses and phrases in the Constitution, if depending on the makeup of the court, there's a tendency to see progressive potential in certain places within the Constitution. But the wisdom of the overall need for the Constitution to constantly be able to adapt. In other words, the idea of a Constitution that was really alive, that was really living, that was really breathing, in order to govern a community that while it's changing, while its demographics change, while its position in the world may be changing, while its economy may be changing, while its environment may be changing, is a Constitution that must always maintain focus on the need to preserve community and on the need to make the kinds of changes that make sustaining community possible. Most of us philosophically believe that in order to function effectively, community must be inclusive and not exclusive. What that means is you can't afford to shut out those who present problems for you. Because if you shut them out of the system, they become threats to that system. Somehow your system must remain flexible enough to accommodate and integrate, the word integration, integrate in order to preserve community. Madison has given us a way to do it. Madison has pointed to the fact that the vote itself in Republican government constitutes the kind of meaningful stake in society that keep people on the straight and narrow, that maintain citizenship. This program is entitled The Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Civic responsibility necessitates the existence of Republican community. It is a community that is always growing, that is always changing, and always accommodating. I think this is one of the most important messages all of us can leave today's program with. This is Bill O'Brien. Remember, no live program tomorrow. For the Virtual Center, thank you so very, very much for listening. Have a great evening. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you.